The biggest mistake people make when deciding between buying and leasing a car isn't choosing the wrong option. It's asking the wrong question in the first place. Everyone gets caught up in comparing monthly payments, interest rates, lease terms, and dealership offers, but almost nobody steps back and asks the one thing that actually determines whether this decision will cost you money or save you money. How long are you realistically going to keep the car? Because here's what happens in real life. Someone walks into a dealership convinced they're going to buy a car because that's what they've always been told is the smarter financial move. They run the numbers, justify the payment, sign the paperwork, and drive off feeling like they made a responsible decision, but 3 years later, they're back at the dealership trading it in for something newer, rolling over whatever balance is left and starting the cycle all over again. At that point, the intention to buy didn't matter. The behavior turned that purchase into something that behaves almost exactly like a lease, except worse. Because instead of simply paying for depreciation, they absorbed the steepest drop in value, paid interest on the full amount, and then reset the clock before ever reaching the point where ownership actually becomes beneficial. This is why the timeline matters more than the method. Buying only works in your favor if you keep the car long enough to spread out the cost and eventually eliminate payments entirely. The longer you hold on to the car, the more that initial expense gets diluted over time. Years without a car payment are where buying starts to create a financial advantage, but if you never reach that stage, then buying loses most of its benefit. On the other side, leasing gets criticized for being a never-ending discover more language learning tool, product reviews, and price comparisons door payment, but it's actually very predictable. You're paying for a specific period of use, usually 2 to 4 years, and then you return the car. There's no illusion of ownership, no expectation that you're building equity, and no long-term commitment beyond the lease term. For someone who already knows they're going to switch cars every few years, leasing aligns perfectly with that behavior. So when someone says leasing is a waste of money, that's only true if your goal is long-term ownership. But if your pattern is upgrading frequently anyway, then leasing might actually be more efficient because you're not repeatedly taking the biggest depreciation hit and dealing with the complexities of selling or trading in a vehicle. This is where most people get it wrong. They mix a short-term mindset with a long-term strategy. They buy a car thinking about ownership, but act like a leaser when it comes to how long they keep it. That mismatch is what costs money. In 2026, this gap is even more noticeable because cars are evolving faster than ever. Technology changes quickly. Features become outdated sooner, and new models bring significant upgrades that make older ones feel obsolete in a shorter period of time. This creates a stronger temptation to upgrade more frequently, which directly conflicts with the idea of holding on to a car long enough to make buying worthwhile. So if you're someone who values having the latest features, updated designs, and new technology every few years, then forcing yourself into buying doesn't automatically make you financially smarter. It just means you're using the wrong tool for your habits. Leasing in that case may actually reduce the friction and cost associated with constantly switching vehicles. But if you're willing to ignore that pressure, keep your car long after the excitement wears off, and focus purely on the financial side, then buying becomes powerful. Because once the loan is paid off, your cost of transportation drops significantly. You go from making monthly payments to just covering maintenance, insurance, and fuel, which is a completely different financial position. The challenge is that most people overestimate their willingness to keep a car long term. At the moment of purchase, it's easy to say you'll drive it for 10 years. But as time goes on, preferences change, lifestyles shift, and the appeal of something new starts to creep in. That's why being honest about your behavior is more important than choosing the option that sounds better on paper. If you know there's a high chance you'll want something different in 3 years, then planning for a 10-year ownership doesn't make sense. And if you're confident you can keep a car for a decade, then leasing becomes unnecessarily expensive over time. Another factor that plays into this is financial flexibility. Buying a car ties up more capital and often comes with higher monthly payments compared to leasing. That difference in cost could be invested elsewhere, used to build savings, or allocated toward opportunities that actually grow your net worth. So again, the decision isn't isolated. It connects to everything else you're doing with your money. When you stretch your budget to buy a car, you won't keep long enough. You're not just losing money on the vehicle itself. You're also losing the opportunity to use that money more effectively elsewhere. And that's a hidden cost that most people don't consider. At the same time, leasing can create a different kind of trap. Because the payments are lower, it becomes easier to justify getting a more expensive car than you would otherwise afford. And since the payments never go away, you can end up normalizing a permanent expense without ever questioning it. So the real goal here isn't to label one option as good and the other as bad. It's to align your choice with your actual behavior and financial priorities. If those two things are out of sync, the numbers will work against you no matter what option you choose. This is why asking how long you'll keep the car is the most important question. It forces you to think beyond the initial excitement, beyond the dealership pitch, and beyond the monthly payment. It shifts the focus to the full life cycle of the decision, which is where the real financial impact shows up. And once you answer that honestly, the right choice becomes much clearer. Not because one option is universally better, but because one option fits your pattern while the other doesn't. In 2026, the biggest shift in the car market isn't just higher prices or new technology, it's how aggressively vehicles lose value the moment you buy them. And that's exactly why buying used and holding onto the car long term has quietly become one of the most powerful financial moves you can make, even though it doesn't feel exciting and doesn't get nearly as much attention as buying new or leasing. Because the moment a brand new car leaves the dealership, it immediately starts losing value. Not slowly, not gradually, but in a sharp drop that can wipe out a significant portion of its price within the first year or two. That initial depreciation is the most expensive part of owning a car, and it's something you pay for whether you realize it or not. When you buy new, you're absorbing that loss directly. You're paying a premium for something that is guaranteed to be worth less almost immediately. And in today's market, where car prices have increased and technology cycles are shorter, that depreciation hit is even more noticeable. Now compare that to buying a slightly used car. Someone else already took that initial hit. The car might be 1 to 3 years old, still in excellent condition, often with modern features, and sometimes even under warranty. But the price is significantly lower because the biggest drop in value has already happened. This creates a gap, and that gap is where the opportunity is. Instead of paying for the most expensive phase of ownership, you're stepping in after the steepest decline. That means your car will continue to depreciate, but at a much slower and more predictable rate. You're essentially shifting the financial burden away from yourself and onto the first owner. And this is where holding the car long-term amplifies the advantage. Because when you combine a lower purchase price with fewer years of depreciation left, your overall cost of ownership drops dramatically over time. Let's break that down in a practical way. If you buy a brand new car and sell it within a few years, you're stacking the worst possible factors together. You paid the highest price up front, experienced the fastest depreciation, and then exited before reaching any real financial benefit. That's the most expensive way to own a car. But if you buy a used car and keep it for many years, you're doing the opposite. You avoided the biggest drop in value, spread out the remaining depreciation over a longer period, and eventually reach a point where the car is fully paid off and still usable. That's where the cost advantage becomes clear. In 2026, this strategy matters even more because the gap between new and used car prices has widened. New cars are more expensive than ever, which means the depreciation in absolute dollars is higher. When a new car loses value, it's not just a percentage, it's a large amount of money disappearing in a short period of time. At the same time, used cars have become more reliable. Improvements in manufacturing, better materials, and longer-lasting components mean that a car with some mileage is no longer seen as risky in the same way it used to be. Many vehicles can run efficiently for well over a decade with proper maintenance, which supports the idea of holding on to them longer. So instead of thinking of a used car as a compromise, it's more accurate to think of it as a strategic move. You're not settling for less, you're optimizing for value, but this only works if you actually commit to keeping the car long enough, because buying used and then selling it quickly reduces the benefit. You still avoid the initial depreciation, but you don't fully capture the long-term savings that come from eliminating payments and extending the life of the vehicle. That's why patience becomes a financial advantage. The longer you keep the car, the more those early savings compound. Eventually, you reach a point where your only costs are maintenance, insurance, and fuel. And compared to someone constantly upgrading or leasing, your expenses are significantly lower. Another overlooked benefit is flexibility. When you're not tied to a car payment, you have more control over your money. You can redirect that cash toward investments, savings, or other priorities that actually build wealth. That shift from paying for a depreciating asset to investing in appreciating ones is what creates long-term financial progress, but there's a psychological challenge here. Driving a used car doesn't always feel as rewarding as driving something brand new. There's no initial excitement, no sense of having the latest model, and sometimes even a perception that you're missing out. That's where most people slip up because they prioritize short-term satisfaction over long-term efficiency. And in a world where social media constantly showcases new purchases, upgrades, and lifestyle improvements, it becomes even harder to stick with something that feels older, even if it's the smarter choice financially. This is where discipline comes in, because the goal isn't to impress other people or keep up with trends. It's to reduce unnecessary expenses and keep more of your money working for you. Every dollar you don't spend on a car is a dollar that can be used somewhere else with better returns. Leasing and buying new both have their place, but they often prioritize convenience, flexibility, and experience over cost efficiency. And there's nothing wrong with that if those are your priorities and you can afford it comfortably. But if the goal is to minimize expenses and maximize long-term financial growth, buying used and holding becomes extremely difficult to beat. It aligns your purchase price with reality, reduces the impact of depreciation, and eventually removes one of the most common monthly expenses from your life. And once that happens, the financial breathing room it creates can be be used to accelerate everything else you're trying to achieve. The key is consistency. It's not just about making the right decision once, but it's about sticking with it long enough to see the benefits, because the real payoff doesn't happen immediately. It shows up over time as your costs stay low while others continue cycling through payments, upgrades, and depreciation. And in a financial landscape where small advantages compound into significant results, that kind of consistency can make a much bigger difference than most people expect.